Igor and Ilan, thanks so much for joining us today. So we're going to talk about monitoring and holistic monitoring generally. And we have Igor here who's going to talk a lot about how Airbnb does what it does. And Ilan and I will jump into the conversation as well. So let's kick it off, Igor, by talking about really what your environment is like and kind of give us a little bit of the lay of the land, what you have to monitor.
Sure. So Airbnb is a pretty recent app. It's only been around for about 7 years. So we kind of grew up at the same time as AWS grew up. We started out on AWS, so we've stuck with them. So our environment is all running on AWS. Our application servers are all EC2 instances. Our database servers are all RDS instances. So we're generally monitoring, like, I've heard some talks here at this conference about like really interesting novel monitoring problems, like how do you monitor ephemeral computation? We thankfully don't have those problems yet. We're just monitoring like straight up instances with services running on them. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah. So all cloud, no on-prem stuff.
That's
You're not dealing with any physical infrastructure. Yeah, cool. All right. And so when it comes to then kind of monitoring as a discipline, I'm curious how you've approached it, and either where you are today, or maybe give us a history lesson of how you got to where you are today.
So I've been at Airbnb for about 3.5 years or so. When I first started there, the monitoring landscape was a little bit fragmented. We were using one monitoring provider that was kind of not always set up on different machines. Like sometimes machines were monitored, sometimes they weren't monitored. We had some like bevy of alerts. It wasn't clear which ones of them were actionable and which ones were not. So part of the project that we've done over the last couple of years has been to clean all of that up and to try to make it an infrastructure that we actually can answer questions about. So we've used a number of tools to do that. One of them, of course, has been New Relic, which has been pretty invaluable. That's been there from day one, like for as long as I've been at Airbnb. I think since I've been there, we've now just made it like a general policy to just always have the New Relic agent in every application we deploy. And that's really convenient because even if you don't have anything else, you at least have like just that. So you have at least like, how's your application doing? How's the error rate? How's the response time? You can like watch for things like that. And then the other things have been, how do you monitor just like systems performance? And how do you monitor your own custom metrics, and how do you alert on these things? So to do that, we went with Datadog. We've been using Datadog for about maybe 2.5 years, something like that. I think one of the reasons why we chose Datadog was because at the same time as we were figuring out our monitoring problem, we were also figuring out our configuration management story. And Datadog seemed like a really great fit there because Datadog is very, it's very API driven. Everything in Datadog is JSON. Like all the dashboards are JSON. All the alerts are just like JSON. Like you can see the strings behind all the alerts. Everything is always like JSON. Everything's programmatically interactable with. So we were able to, as we moved to configuration management and set up Chef in our environment, we were able to make sure that through Chef, we have always set up the Datadog agent to be running on every instance. And then we were able to set it up so that our applications can use the Datadog's built-in StatsD reporting to do custom metric monitoring.
So it sounds like there's a little bit of a difference in a data set that you collect then between monitoring tools and how you might fit them into your tool belt. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit and just maybe at a fundamental level kind of what it is that you get and the types of data that you might be collecting out of different components of your software and your infrastructure?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. So one thing is just like stuff you didn't think to monitor. And that's the kind of stuff you get from New Relic. Like just by installing the agent, you can see like all your various like requests and application traces, and you can see how your different endpoints are doing. Even if you haven't installed any custom StatsD kind of metrics on those endpoints, you can see them in the New Relic dashboard. So that's like a base layer. But then beyond that, you probably know some things you want to monitor. And so for those things, you have to set up metrics, and those come from a couple of different places. One of those is just like system level metrics, which just by running a Datadog agent or some other monitoring agent, you can get those, like CPU, memory, things like that. But then the other big thing is kind of Etsy's approach of monitor all the things, which are StatsD metrics. That's usually the approach people use in their applications. And of course, the disadvantage to those is that if you don't have them, then they're not there. Like if you don't set them up, you don't get them. So if you're like debugging an incident and you're like, oh gosh, I wish I knew how this thing was performing, but there's no like stats-D metrics there to help you do that, then you won't be able to answer any questions. And there, like maybe New Relic can help you, but sometimes it doesn't go deep enough. So then you have to retroactively add the metrics you want, and then hopefully you'll be able to like answer the question the next time the outage happens, or hope maybe it's still happening. So.
And Ilan, is that something you could talk to a little bit more about? The notion of stats-D monitoring and even custom monitoring, other ways that fits into the holistic monitoring approach.
Yeah, I mean, New Relic and other APM tools and profiling tools in general, they're fantastic. But at the end of the day, the tool doesn't know what's most interesting to you as an organization. They don't know what your key transactions are. An API request a health check looks the same way as an API request for one of your key customers. It just happens to be maybe calling, it's probably even calling similar back-end things, but we can't tell which one is, which is the piece that makes the widget that your company is trying to deliver. And so as you build custom metrics for yourself, whether that be with New Relic or Datadog, you can start to get the timings and the occurrences of the things that you're there for, the reason your service exists, rather than just knowing that a SQL query might have taken a little longer that time. You can start to see how did that impact the actual key performance indicators for your application.
And there's also, of course, Datadog does quite a bit on the infrastructure side as well.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about that and the approach there and how Datadog approaches it?
So out of the box, Datadog picks up metrics and events from hundreds of open source and commercial applications. So everything from your operating systems to your data stores, databases, things like Postgres, MySQL, Redis, which I know you've spoken quite a bit about using. Mm-hmm. And so as the key there is having all of that in a single place. So we also pull in data from things like New Relic, and so it's actually quite interesting to see how did your AppDex score change as as you made the change to some back-end service, replaced a database node or deployed some new code or what have you. Yeah. And pulling that all together in a single view is actually quite interesting. You can, rather than looking at 10 different dashboards, we can show it to you in a single place. Yeah. I don't know about I know we've talked a little bit about New Relic and Datadog in your infrastructure, but I'm guessing you probably have a couple other tools in there as well.
So we've tried to standardize almost entirely on Datadog. I mean, we use New Relic UI for like those things that New Relic gathers. It's like perfect for those things. But then as far as like building dashboards that let you see like everything that's happening from all the different places that could affect a particular product or service, the place for that for us is Datadog. And this has been especially valuable because we're running on AWS.
Right.
When you use something like RDS, you don't get your own. You don't get to run your own monitoring.
Right.
So the Datadog, like the
CloudWatch
and the CloudWatch integration, like there's almost nothing worse than like pointing your engineers at the AWS console and telling them to look at CloudWatch. Yeah. Just like, and even if they are willing to do that and they can figure their way around that console, they're only going to see the CloudWatch metrics there. They're not going to see like, oh, how is my RDS performance affected by an uptick in like API calls to a certain endpoint. And the only way that you can see those kinds of data and correlate those things together is by having a single dashboard that shows you data from whether it be New Relic, your custom metrics, your system metrics, your like custom application metrics like Redis, or your CloudWatch integration kind of stuff.
I mean, lots of folks are doing things like, we were talking a little bit earlier about log search and how that plays into this space as well, right? And those are interesting metrics too, but the idea that you really want to be able to come to a single place to view all of that together rather than looking at logging into 5 or 6 different monitoring tools to look at those dashboards individually on different timescales and different visualizations and wondering how they all fit together and trying to reason that in your head rather than just in a tool that does it for you. That's kind of where we think we succeed.
So Igor, how does that come together at Airbnb? I mean, who has responsibility for that to actually own the monitoring and set it up? And is it distributed? Is it centralized? Is there a standard process, or how do you go about it?
This is the important question, right? Yeah. So you can provide people in your company with all the tools that you want, but unless people are actually willing to use them, then it doesn't do anybody any good. So there's a couple of pieces to this puzzle. One piece is just making the tooling really, really easy to use. Datadog for us is basically that. In most applications people work in, they just like, there's already a Datadog agent, or like it's really easy to create one. It's like the little stats-D agent that accepts like these really simple stats-D calls. And so monitoring the performance of your product is as simple as calling .increment whenever a certain event happens. And I think Datadog makes does a pretty good job adding tagging to things so that you can actually split out the things you want to look at. Who configures all this stuff? So at Airbnb, we have this philosophy that it's kind of like this quote that I've seen on the screen at this conference several times, which is from Werner Vogels at Amazon, which is you build it, you run it. So if you build it, then it's up to you to be operating this thing at Airbnb. And so that includes knowing when it's broken and knowing what it means for it to be broken in the first place. So that means that as you're setting up your configuration management for your instances that are going to run your service, you should make sure that if you need to monitor any system things, you add that to your configuration management. But most of the time, people don't have systems dependencies, or they get that kind of monitoring for free. And then the only kind of monitoring they need to add is like just the specific like statsd calls around the endpoints that are in their application that they're working on. So given that they've done that, then it's also up to them to make sure that they get alerted when things go wrong. We have a framework actually, which we've open sourced like a big piece of it. We should probably do a little more there for how to create alerts. We have like a programmatic alert system where people can write alerts in a configurable way, and they can submit them for code review. It's a configuration management for alerts basically, and people send those alerts to their team and try to figure out like how to respond to those. But it's not by any means a solved problem for us either. There's definitely times when someone will deploy an application and just fail to look at the dashboard, or in those cases we try to make it so that our tooling will proactively ping people and be like, hey, you just deployed the service and now the error rate is increased, so you should take a look at the error rate. Maybe you should consider rolling back.
So engineers within your organization are creating the alerts for the apps that they interact with themselves.
Right, yeah. So there's a really busy repository called alerts where there's a Ruby DSL file for every alert that people get, and people are writing those all the time.
So I imagine folks are, I mean, that's always the situation I'd like to be in, right? Where somebody else is not defining what wakes you up in the middle of the night. You have control over where.
You should have, you and your team should be able to discuss what is going to wake me up in the middle of the night. And you shouldn't just be able to just define something. People are like, where did this come from?
Yeah. So what are your, I mean, there's sort of two schools of thought right now around alerting, right? One of the ones what Datadog has been professing for a bit now is alerting on work metrics versus resource metrics, where work is sort of the business metrics, the output of what your organization builds, whether it be API calls or physical objects in a factory, and resources being all the things that go into there. What types of things do you find you're alerting on?
I find that in most of our alerting, we alert on both. We would like to have alerting on just overall systems metrics, but those can be hard to route. If you know that your application logins dropped, or that your signups are down or something like that, then that's really important, but it's really difficult to understand who should receive that alert and who should take action in response to that alert. What you end up doing is having a team of people who's just because they care so much, they end up doing that all the time, and that is not good. It's not a good situation, because then they get burned out and they're frustrated with their teammates who are breaking things and they're fixing them. Yeah. So I prefer when alerts are defined on a more granular level, or when you can find a team that owns a particular metric. So for instance, you might decide that your growth team, which is doing a lot of experimentation around signups with various integration partners, those people are the likeliest people to own your logins metric, because they're the ones who are likeliest affected by adding Webull logins or something. Maybe those people can own that metric, and then they can define the alert that will ping them if it goes bad.
So that sounds like kind of a distributed and even personalized approach to alerting then? You really try to get them into the front of the people who need to see the most? And
we have no operations team. There's no one's job to just look at all alerts and fix them. That should be the job of the people who own the code.
And is there then a incident management or problem response process that you follow across the teams, given that this is so distributed, or how do you go about that?
There's an incident process where if someone or some team is responsible for an incident, then they will write a postmortem. The purpose of which is not to assign blame to people, but to showcase what went wrong in this situation and what we can do to make sure that it doesn't happen again in the future. Sure. And people just write those as things happen. Should we try to do people in the audience have questions? I notice the time is ticking down.
Yeah. And is there something that you wanted to show as well? Is that? worthwhile
we
doing?
were just hoping, we have a computer, so if people want to see something in particular, we can maybe do some demos.
Yep, happy to chat about how any of our organizations do monitoring.
Yeah.
There's mics in the room back there if you do have questions. There we go.
Hello? Yep, there we go.
Hi.
Hello.
So you have a separate repository where you keep your alerts.
That's right.
How do you manage making sure that the alerts are still in sync with the code base that they're being developed for, and so that there's not drift there?
I mean, I guess it's on the individual teams. Yeah, I mean, so like one of two things can happen. One thing that could happen is that you've added some new thing that is important to monitor, but you haven't set up an alert on it. And in those cases, I don't know what we can do about that. We can try to like somehow define alerts like in the code where you're also making your code changes, but that seems like really messy. The other thing that might happen is that maybe you used to alert on some metric, and now that metric is no longer relevant to alert on. So in that case, like that alert just kind of becomes orphaned, and then maybe it will spuriously alert you. Our philosophy is that if you get an alert, you should do one of two things. You should either fix the problem that caused the alert to happen, or you should fix the alert so it doesn't fire you for no reason, or like ping you for no reason. So ideally, like if the alert goes stale and starts firing for no reason, then people will go and just delete it or whatever.
It's fairly low friction to add and remove alerts in that workflow. So if you need to remove it for the day or what have you, it's not.
Yeah, that's right. It's got like a silenced until field that you can put a timestamp. We'll have additional questions. I guess we can also just like keep talking amongst ourselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we can all.
Yeah. So, I'm curious more.
Actually, I had a quick question, if
yeah,
that's okay.
yeah.
With most organizations, sometimes you said that New Relic was part of the, from the get-go, when you started, was part of Airbnb's monitoring philosophy. Were there any other legacy monitors that existed, and could you speak to like how that transition occurred and what you had to do to kind of wrangle? So like an example being like, Nagios for a long, long time has been the kind of a de facto monitoring for some parts of that legacy, and was there any stuff that you had to kind of shoehorn in to get it to all work together?
Yeah. So the monitoring provider we used to use before Datadog, we just did a project to migrate everything that was in there into Datadog, and that just wasn't much. Like it just was used so inconsistently that there wasn't much stuff to migrate. One of the reasons why we chose Datadog is because everything is defined in code, including our dashboards and our alerts. That means that we're not, I mean, as much as I like Datadog, but it means we're not like tied to Datadog. If like something goes wrong or like our partnership is not working out for whatever reason, I feel pretty confident that we could at least move a lot of our own custom setup around our metrics. And so then the thing that really ties you to a particular monitoring system is the data, the historical data that's already in there. In particular, we do a lot of alerting that's like, oh, how does this metric compare to this metric like a week ago or a month ago or a year ago? And that is like a more difficult problem. So we still run our own Graphite cluster because it has this like historic data for like going back like years into the past that we people have been reluctant to terminate completely. So we're logging to both places sometimes, but it's just like so much more difficult to use Graphite to look at any sort of data than it is to use Datadog that people, for the most part, it's like falling into like slow obsolescence. At some point, we'll have enough historical data stream in Datadog also that we won't need to keep that thing running. But that's definitely a concern. Like that's something that like concerns me about our, we depend on Datadog quite heavily, which I'm not like, it's fine. It's been working great so far. We're extremely happy customers. I don't know if I succeeded in answering your question.
Hi. Are all of your alerts handled manually by people, or do you have some things that can be handled by automatic systems?
So I mean, from the tooling perspective, alerts can do anything from an email to a Slack channel to even triggering API calls via things like webhooks. But I think that does pose an interesting question and one I'd love to hear the Airbnb perspective on. But say you have an alert that triggers a restart of a service. I think that's interesting if you're at a point where maybe that happens once in a while and it's helped prevent somebody from waking up. But I wonder if that might be the solution when you're restarting 100 times an hour and having the alert do it for you if maybe you're hiding problems. But it is something that I see folks do. I think it's probably a philosophy question of how you approach your alerts and your infrastructure.
Right. So when people write these alerts files at Airbnb, they're supposed to write like a pretty large description about what the alert means. The things that I ask people to include in alerts will usually be like, why is this alert important? How do I figure out if this alert is real or not? If this alert is like where do I go to see more information about the problem? If this alert is real, like what are some things that I can begin doing to resolve the problem? And like maybe who are the people who are most knowledgeable about this kind of thing if you need help? And so you might say, well, at the point at which you're writing in your alert description, like basically the information you need to resolve the problem, why don't you just automate the resolution of that problem so a human doesn't have to deal with it? But that is like a way to sweep problems under the rug, right? Like now this automated system will like automatically do whatever to fix my service, but like why is it having that problem in the first place? Like if engineers are getting pinged about it, then I think
we call it pain-driven development. Yeah.
Pain-driven development, where like you're having pain, so you want to make it so the problem doesn't happen. So I think philosophically, I would prefer that approach rather than like the alerts programmatically fix themselves kind of approach.
Hey, you say you're in AWS. I'm just wondering how much you monitor AWS events and some of their logs. So like auto-scaling events, CloudTrail logs, and maybe VPC flow logs, stuff like that.
So Datadog has pretty good integration with AWS. And also our own tagging is always like tagged by all the AWS attributes. So I think we have alerts on things like, oh, traffic has dropped off just in this region, for instance, or something like that. And then like teams have their own priorities. So for instance, it's most important for our security team to be monitoring CloudTrail logs. So they have their own view of that is like important for them, and I'm not super familiar with it. I just know that we have the tools necessary, and you can see those in Datadog as well. So like sometimes that's like proven useful for me when I'm like debugging. Like, did someone restart that memcache cluster? Like, what is going on here?
Yeah, I mean, it provides that I think the CloudWatch data and a lot of the CloudTrail data they're great for context. So if you're using something like if you're for whatever you are using for your core monitoring tool, where you're maybe with Datadog we're collecting maybe seconds of granularity, having that the 5-minute level granularity or the specific events like logins that have occurred in something like CloudTrail or CloudWatch are helpful in letting you know why something happened in your infrastructure. So when you're everything goes wacky in US East 1D or something, why did that occur? And looking at events such as incidents in Amazon on their status dashboard or CloudWatch metrics that maybe corroborate that data, or logins into the console where maybe somebody changed some security group rule. It's all useful to overlay that on your graphs and try to figure out what is the cause, what's the context of why that occurred.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we are just at the end of our time. So
We still have 2 seconds left. Okay.
all right. Well, Igor and Ilan, thank you so much. And thank you all for attending today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Also, I think we both love talking about monitoring.
Yeah.
So if you have like more monitoring questions, feel free to corner us over in the corner.
Yep. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.